I'd like to thank today's witnesses for appearing before the committee today to discuss the effects of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration's recent enactment hours of service regulation on small business. Before I read the rest of my statement, I'd like to thank the FMCSA Administrator and Farrell for being here. While we may disagree deeply on this issue, I always appreciate how forthcoming you've been. It's kind of you to be here. On July 1st, 2013, the FMCSA enacted its new rules for hours of service for commercial drivers. Among the rules, many provisions, the revised 34-hour restart requirements, have caused the most damage to the integrity of the rulemaking process in our nation's economy, particularly small business. Small businesses are greatly affected by changes to trucking hours of service, whether it is small carrier transporting goods to the West Coast or a local grocery store awaiting delivery shipments. When truckers are slowed, small businesses suffer. The Small Business Committee is deeply concerned about the impact of these new regulations on small businesses. The Moving Ahead for Progress, MAP 21, legally required the FMCSA to conduct a statistically valid field study on the then proposed 34-hour restart provision that measures the effects of the proposed rule on both large and small trucking operators. This study was due to Congress by September 30th, 2013. It has not yet been delivered. Under MAP 21 provisions, congressional intent was to have the study completed before the enactment of the new rule. However, even with the field study unfinished, the FMCSA finalized and enacted these untested new hours of service regulation. Since July, small businesses, workers, and consumers across America have raised serious concerns about the restrictive 34-hour restart provisions of the rule, which went into effect without being backed by solid data, research, or a representative sample of the trucking industry. While the FMCSA has found that the new rule would cost truckers less than 1% of revenue per year and impacted less than 15% of commercial drivers, the trucking industry, on the other hand, estimates that the hours of service rule in reality cost $376 million annually to its sector alone. By any measure, this is a large sum of money and costs jobs. In fact, the latest American Transportation Research Institute surveyed commercial drivers found that nearly 70% have lost pay since the enactment of the rule provision. The survey also found that 80% of carriers are experiencing a loss in productivity. The trucking industry is a key link in our small business chain. Not only are many trucking companies small businesses, but also nearly every type of small business in our country, food, lodging, cement, retail, apparel, asphalt, depend on efficient, on-time, reliable trucking to sell, move, and use their goods. Most disturbingly, there is a case to be made that the rule does not only cause economic harm, but may also make our roads less safe. In the past, when drivers completed the 60 or 70-hour work week, he or she would need to spend 34 hours not driving to reset their week clock to 0 hours. Now the restart time must include drivers resetting for 2 consecutive periods between 1 a.m. and 5 a.m. The new rule, therefore, compels truckers to stop driving by 7 p.m. at the earliest in order to take the most advantage for the restart and begin driving again at 5 a.m. 2 days later. Commercial motor vehicle drivers often drive at night, both as a matter of preference and necessity and convenience. The FMCSA, in effect, is pushing truckers onto the road at an earlier time in the day during morning and evening commutes and school rush hours, slowing them down and prompting safety concerns. I look forward to hearing more about the new rules of service and how they've affected small businesses across America. And I want to express to the committee my appreciation for Ann Farrell again. I also want to take just a moment. This is a letter that I received the day before yesterday from the Prospect Transportation Company, a woman-owned business, been in business for, I think, since the 1950s or before. This is, I'll try to get to the meat of it here. She says, unfortunately, the 34-hour restart provision, specifically the requirement of 2 periods of off between 1 a.m. and 5 a.m., has taken away the quality of life, reduced productivity, as well as disrupted the driver's normal sleep schedule and has done nothing to show its improved safety. And I give you a copy of this, and I submit this for the record. Administrator, you may begin. Oh, I'm sorry. I left you out there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With more than $600 billion in revenue in 2012, the trucking sector is the backbone of our nation's economy. Employing nearly 7 million individuals, it is essential to the success of America's companies that depend on the timely delivery of their goods to customers around the globe. And not surprisingly, like so many other industries, the trucking sector is dominated by small businesses. In fact, more than 97% of trucking companies maintain fleets with fewer than 20 trucks. Central to the performance of this industry is its ability to operate in a safe manner for its employees, its consumers, and the public that shares the road. On average, truck crashes are responsible for nearly 4,000 deaths and 100,000 injuries every year. In an attempt to reduce these accidents caused by sleep deprivation, the federal government has been regulating hours of service for truck drivers since 1937. These rules have gone through a number of changes over the years in response to evolving research on driver fatigue and traffic-related accident patterns. This July, after years of lawsuits and debate by industry participants and public safety advocates, the newest version of these rules went into effect. These new changes maintain the maximum driving limit at 11 hours, but require that it take place within a 14-hour period. Drivers are now limited to one 34-hour restart in a 7-day period and required to take periodic 30-minute breaks. Such provisions were included to ensure that drivers were better rested when they are behind the wheel. Taken as a whole, the new rules represent a significant change in how and when truckers will be able to operate. From a public safety perspective, many have suggested that the rule falls short and does not go far enough to address driver fatigue. By not reducing the 11-hour driving limit, some believe that the rule will not be effective in reducing driver fatigue. Similarly, the 34-hour start rule could be used in a manner that would result in operators being able to drive more hours than before. Such outcomes could lead to more tired drivers on the road and adversely impact highway safety. From the industry perspective, we continue to hear that the rules are costly and burdensome. A recent study by the American Transportation Research Institute found that the changes FMCSA made to the restart requirement will ultimately have a net annual cost of up to $376 million, rather than the net benefit of $133 million the agency claimed. In addition, the ATRI found that the rule has led to a productivity decrease of 3 to 4%. This has led many carriers to have to spend more to achieve the same level of performance as they did prior to the rule's implementation. Finally, research has indicated that the new rule has increased drivers' dissatisfaction during a time when there is driver shortage and led to no changes in safety performance. Such outcomes call into question the justification for the rule. Taken as a whole, the rule reduces driver flexibility. This trade-off will undoubtedly affect drivers as weather delays and the uncertainty associated with loading and unloading often require them to be highly adaptable. By requiring mandatory breaks and 2 consecutive nights at home, operators will be less able to tailor their schedules to the constantly changing factors that they confront each week. Today, we will examine all of these claims and how the hours of service rules are affecting small trucking companies as well as their potential to reduce traffic accidents. As with so many rules, analysis done prior to implementation can only tell us so much. Time will only show what the true effect of this rule will be on the industry and on public safety. With this in mind, it's imperative that Congress continue to oversee the rule's implementation. Doing so will help ensure that new regulations are striking the proper balance between promoting safer roads with the economic impact on small trucking companies and their drivers. Overall, it is important that we seek to achieve our policy objectives without unnecessarily burdening those small businesses that are subject to these regulations. In advance of the testimony, I want to thank Administrator Farrell and all our witnesses today who traveled here for both their participation and insights into this important topic. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. If committee members have opening statements, they may submit them for the record. You are familiar with how the clocks work. We want to hear from you, so, Administrator Farrell, you may begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Mang, thank you very much for this opportunity today to talk about the Hours of Service Rule and its impact on small business. The top priority of FMCSA is safety, reducing fatalities and injuries due to large truck and bus crashes. According to NHTSA's most recent report in 2012, nearly 4,000 people were killed in crashes involving trucks. That's a 4% increase over 2011, which was actually a higher number than 2010. Truck drivers work some of the toughest and longest hours of any business and in some of the most difficult operating conditions. It is a demanding and unappreciated job, certainly underappreciated. FMCSA's changes to the Hours of Service rules will help truck drivers avoid the long-term health problems that can be caused by these demanding schedules, and will also help prevent an estimated 1,400 crashes, 560 injuries, and save 19 lives a year by reducing the risk of fatigue-related crashes. These 19 lives could be your community's kindergarten class, could be your son's baseball team, could be members of your extended family. This rule was initiated by congressional requirements that date back to the 1995 Interstate Commerce Commission Termination Act. After a series of lawsuits, FMCSA developed the current rule through solid data and an unprecedented level of transparency, soliciting feedback from thousands of stakeholders, including small business owners, drivers, shippers, safety advocates, law enforcement, and trucking companies. Recently, the D.C. Circuit Court largely upheld the rule. Critics have focused their attention on the change we made to the 34-hour restart provision. A restart allows a driver to work more than the maximum limits of 60 hours in 7 days or 70 hours in 8 days. The rule limits that restart, and it is a voluntary restart, to once a week, which does reduce a driver's work week to 70 hours on average from the 80 hours that were potentially available under the prior rule. Again, a restart is a voluntary tool that only a small percentage of drivers really need to use. Someone driving 60 hours or less does not ever need to use that restart. DOT began examining the possibility of a restart as early as 1998, when we first assembled an expert panel to review the sleep science associated with excessively long work periods. Prior to 2003, there was no restart, meaning drivers found themselves many times a long way from home, waiting to have the hours to be able to drive again. That 1998 panel recommended, quote, a continuous recovery time of sufficient length to include at least 2 midnight to 6 a.m. uninterrupted time periods. In other words, the Washington State University study that is at issue today confirmed over a decade of sleep research relating to the effects of fatigue and CMV operations. But we still sought extensive public input on the WSU study, and in fact, through that input, we were convinced to tighten up that period of off-duty and rest time to include, instead of midnight to 6 a.m., a restart that include a period of 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. with no loss in safety. Many critics want us to return to the restart provision that was implemented in 2003. It's important for you to know that that restart provision that the courts criticized when they threw out the 2003 rule is the same restart that had only one lab study, a lab study with fewer participants than anything we did. In fact, a lab study that was carried out by ATA through a congressional earmark. This rule will help save the trucking industry and actually our nation, the public at large, an estimated $87 billion a year in the costs and implications of crashes. In fact, even ATA's own research is failing to show a significant impact on a driver's hours. Their recent ATRI report that was released shows that less than a third of 1% of drivers' logbooks actually changed after the rule went into effect July 1. Even we estimated a larger impact than that. The only data they've produced to show that driver schedules hardly changed, or drivers did change, was through that survey. But their logbook examples and their logbook analysis showed a very small change. Bringing the Restart research full circle, I am happy to report that the agency has been very diligent in pressing ahead as soon as MAP 21 requirements and the congressional mandate for a field study on the 34-hour restart get underway. We have completed the data collection, and I'm looking forward to sharing our findings with Congress as soon as the full report is complete. I want to draw on my experience, my very recent experience, and a really treasured one, where I had the opportunity to ride along for 2 days with Leo Wilkins, a professional owner-operator. My time with this remarkable small business owner helped me better understand the challenges truck drivers face and to experience firsthand what the agency's safety rules mean to a driver's daily life. I also saw how the shipper and receiver drive the unpredictability that plagues the trucking industry. Exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act for more than 7 decades, truck drivers, by and large, are paid by the mile or by the load, and the hours a driver might spend waiting for a load could cost that driver a day's pay. Driver pay and extreme loading dock delays have a significant impact on a driver's ability to be efficient, professional, and safe. In short, uncompensated delays force drivers to press legal and physical limits to capture that day's pay. The logistics industry gets this time free on the backs of drivers and the backs of small business. Uncompensated detention time needs your attention, because what makes the job better often makes the job and the driver safer. Keeping people safe is not a choice. It must be achieved with a mix of effective programs and enforcement that sets a level playing field where companies that put safety first aren't competing against folks that are cutting corners or pushing limits. Saving lives is FMCSA's fundamental mission. It is our solemn obligation to the public. And again, I thank you for inviting me to speak on this topic today and look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask Mr. Rice to.
Yes, Mrs. Farrell, thank you again for meeting with us a couple of weeks ago, and thank you for being here today. I know that it's not the easiest position to be facing all these questions, but you know, there are a lot of concerns. We want to make sure that we do this right. Everybody's concerned with safety. Everybody's also concerned with efficiency, and we don't want to take people their ability to do business away from them. So we don't want to insert the government into their lives any more than we need to. The rule that was in effect before, you say it was put in effect in 2003?
That's correct.
And what's the short version difference between what's proposed today and the 2003 rule?
Sure. Three key differences. The restart, the 34-hour restart is retained. Its use is limited to once in a week or once in 168 hours. That restart needs to include 2 periods between 1 a.m. and 5 a.m., 2 periods of off-duty time in order to ensure the driver gets that kind of recovery sleep they need. And it incorporates a 30-minute break during the driver's workday sometime before that any driving occurs after the 8th hour on duty.
Right.
So there's time anywhere within that 8.
What was the actual effect of the 2003 rule on injuries, fatalities, accidents, so forth?
I would say that question is still under analysis. We generally gauge the impact of our rules and the impact of our work within the mix of strategies that really goes into achieving safety on our highways. And while the fatal crash rate was, I think, collectively and with the economy, we successfully lowered it to its lowest point in history in 2009. It has steadily climbed a few percent each year, and that's really the fatal and injury crash rate relating to truck and bus crashes.
Now, it's today, isn't it 20, 30% below what it was 15 years ago?
That's correct. That's correct.
So it's way down.
We are very pleased, and we continue to drive it lower to the extent feasible.
All right, and in this study that was done, how many people participated in that?
Are you referring to the Washington, the current
The one that's
study, or
been done but's not completed. How many people were in that?
Oh, on our field study, we've got 106 drivers participating. Yeah, a good mix of
And then
industry
the
types.
Washington study, how many were in that?
Well, I will need to provide the detail for the record, but there were at least, I believe, 9 to 12 in the first round, and perhaps 15. It's a two-phase study, so combined, I think it was close to 18 or 20 subjects.
All right. Today, how many fatalities from trucking accidents are there average in America today?
Again, FAR's, NHTSA just released its most recent data, what they call the FAR's report, and that identified just about 4,000 fatalities related to truck-related crashes. That excludes the bus piece.
And your best estimate of the effect on that, if these new rules are implemented, what's your best estimate?
The analysis we incorporated into the rule development is 19 lives per year are expected to be saved from this rule.
Which is, just quick math, less than 0.5%.
19 lives. Each one of those lives.
But
is very
actually,
significant.
it's such a small percentage that we won't even know if these rules are having any effect, will we?
The individuals whose lives are saved will know every day. I know it's tough to prove a negative.
It's nice to say that, and it tugs at the heartstrings, but the truth is that sample is so small that you won't know whether this rule has any effect or not.
I disagree. Every life is precious. One life lost is one too many. You may think that sounds trite, but I disagree.
My point is, we don't know if it's going to save any lives.
Well, we've got 1,400 crashes that are expected to be reduced, 450 injuries that are expected to be avoided, 19 lives saved every year. That adds up.
The sample is so small that we won't know if this rule has any effect.
Well, it's not a sample. Those are actual lives. And I will absolutely continue to disagree vehemently on that point with you. I think you also uphold the preciousness of each life.
Oh, I do, but where I disagree with you is I don't think that you know, and you can't tell from your study, which isn't complete, whether it's going to save one life or not. But we do know that it's going to have a tremendous economic effect on the trucking industry. Did your study, in its analysis of these 19 lives that could be saved, did it take into account the fact that truckers are now going to be moved into rush hour traffic? That the driving hours are going to be forced into rush hour traffic because you're taking them off of the highway at the times when they can drive with no traffic?
It's so interesting, and I think that's part of the
just a yes or no. Did it?
Let me say no. This rule does not put trucks in traffic any more than they already are in traffic. Trucks are.
So you're saying your study did not take that into account?
The study accounted for the impact and the costs on industry of this rule, upwards of $500 million. We absolutely.
I'm not talking about the cost. What I'm asking you is, did your study take into account the fact that under this rule, truckers are going to be taken off the road in early morning hours when they want to drive, when there's no traffic and it's safer, and forced to drive in hours where there's in rush hour where it's going to be slower and it's going to be more dangerous? Did it take that into account?
Absolutely. The Reg Eval identified that roughly 7% of the 3 million drivers out there operating that are affected by this rule are impacted by that one time a week use, 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. inclusion, 34-hour restart.
I'm still not
7%.
answering my question.
Yes, but what my point is, 93% of all operations don't change. They continue to operate. Trucks continue to operate overnight schedules.
Mr. Chairman,
routinely.
are we going to do another round of questions? I see I'm over my time. Are we going to do another round?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Clark?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member. I have no questions at this time. Thank you.
Mr. Tipton?
Thanks for taking the time to be here, and appreciate, and I think everyone on this panel shares your passion. It's something as Americans that we all value every life.
Mm-hmm.
But I was curious, in the opening part of your statement, you said the purpose of this is actually safety, and you attributed 4,000 people have been killed in crashes involving trucks. Does your data show that all 4,000 deaths were caused by the truck, or was it caused by the other driver in the crash?
Our data does not include an analysis of crash causation. The last time we were able to do that was...
So you're taking the leap that it was the truck driver's fault. You don't know.
Out of 4,000 crashes, we certainly know that...
You do?
Absolutely.
It's the truck driver's fault.
I was about to complete the response. In 2003, we carried out a thing called a large truck crash causation study, a very important study where we analyzed individual crashes to determine causation factors. And that analysis results in data that demonstrates up to 40% of fatal crashes are on in the hands of the truck driver. Actually, I'm afraid that's close to 35%. And 45% injury crashes are related to actions by the truck driver. So that's the most
far
recent,
less than half. I just wanted to kind of clarify,
absolutely.
because
That's the
you
most
were
recent.
intimating in your testimony that this was caused by trucks. You're now stating less than 50% of this was actually caused by the truck drivers.
No. I'm always very careful to say 4,000 crashes in 4,000 deaths in crashes relating or involving trucks and buses. It does not attribute fault. And in this case, the rule estimates 19 lives saved relating to truck-caused crashes.
Well, I think that's just where we want to be very cautious, that you don't overreach in terms of trying to put it in a regulatory process, that when we talk about families, some of these truck drivers are trying to provide for their families. They're paid by the mile. And when you're shutting them down and they aren't able to actually produce and generate revenue for those families, there are going to be some real impacts. I'm curious, how many logs did you look at in terms of what drivers in terms of trying to develop a rule?
Well, I will provide that for the record. We certainly included a log survey, driver surveys, as well as logbook analysis in our rule development.
Okay, so you don't have any idea of how many logs you actually looked at?
We look at logs every day across the country.
You look at logs.
But in terms of an actual study, unbiased study and a very clear study, that's actually documented in the record.
I believe by your estimation, 15% of truck drivers operate at the maximum weekly. Is that correct?
Yeah, yes. In our estimation, it was 15% of the driving population impacted by this rule because of the nature of their operations, being overnight and over the road.
How's this going to impact the other 85%?
Actually, insignificant to none.
Insignificant to none.
That's correct.
So, are they going to be allowed to use the same 34-hour restart?
They don't. They may. It is voluntary. A driver operating 60 hours or less does not need the restart.
Does the rule imply that?
Oh, that's been a long-standing rule.
Rule.
That didn't require anything new.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, Administrator, you say in past research you found 240,000 drivers work an average of 70 hours or more per week. And can you tell me how your 2007 field study shows that drivers work that much time on average each week?
I will certainly follow that up on the record with that analysis, yes.
Okay, if you can give us some written testimony on that, we'd certainly appreciate that. And you stated that your restart study will be delayed until next spring. I assume that's in part due to your peer review process?
It is under review as we speak. That's correct.
Okay. Do you have your 2011 hours of service regulatory impact study peer reviewed?
Oh, it receives extensive review through the notice and comment rulemaking process.
Generally, is it going to have peer review as my
Well, that's
question.
completed. The studies that are incorporated and used in that analysis are peer-reviewed studies.
And that is completed.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Good. You know, I'd like to shift a little bit, if I may. And, this is going to go over actually in some oil field work. Was this rule a restatement or a revision?
Which rule is that?
Okay, this in regards to the FMCSA 1962 guidance in regards to off-duty for the statement of guidance on CMV truck drivers subject to the OHS exemptions under 40 CFR.
Yes, Congressman, what we refer to generally as the oil field exemption is something that the ICC put in place over 50 years ago, and there are two pieces to it. The first provides any trucking operation or driver servicing an oil field has certain special treatment under the hours of service rule. They are allowed a 24-hour restart regardless, and that's longstanding. That guidance has not been in dispute.
Okay. And I just want to make clear for me, was this a revision of the rule, or was it a restatement of the rule?
No, the second piece relates to specialized equipment and those eligible for certain off-duty time accounting, and it was not a change or it was a restatement of the guidance that's been in place for 50
So
years.
it's a restatement. Did that go through the formal rulemaking process?
It went through the formal notice and comment process. It's not a rulemaking.
It's not a rulemaking.
It's not a rulemaking, no.
Is it having the impact of a rule?
I believe it is not having the impact of a rule. It's guidance that's been on the books for 50 years. The origins of the restatement were the various ways, the differences in the manner in which it was being enforced across the country as our country's energy independence has really expanded and the development and exploration has expanded. Companies who were operating in 4 or 5 regions at a time noticed that it was being enforced by local officers differently. Right. And they said, could you please get some clarification out there? That's what we did. It prompted some real concerns about those who interpreted it differently. But again, we restated the guidance, and we've worked very intensely with industry to ensure that they understand there is an exemption request for that specialized equipment that fits in a gray area, and that they need to go ahead and submit their requests for consideration and for public notice. And that process has begun in some cases.
Okay. I'm out of time, but I think we're going to have a second round. We'll follow up a little bit on that. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Mr. Yuleskamp?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate having this hearing today. This is an important issue to a number of my constituents, and receive certainly complaints about this, and a couple questions. And I'm sorry I came late. And to pronounce your last name, Ms. Farrell?
Farrell, that's
Farrell.
correct.
Okay, well, thank you, Ms. Farrell. I appreciate that. I appreciate your comment, all life is precious. That's actually not the official line of the administration, and I'd love to visit with you further about that and on a number of life issues. But I want to ask you a little more follow-up questions of my colleague from Colorado as far as the MAP study is required under the law. Was that required before you could finalize the restart rule, or was that just something you could do whenever you decided it needed to be complete?
The MAP 21 field study of our 34-hour restart provisions was something that Congress said complete. It did not connect it to the effective date of the rule. And the rule, of course, at the time had already been finalized for over a year and published for just about a year.
And it was being enforced?
Well, it took effect July 1 of last year, of this year, pardon me, July 1 of this year. Time flies, we're already in December.
And there was no way you could get it done in 12 months to have it completed?
No. The mandate, the MAP 21 mandate was something that we took on immediately as soon as that bill was signed to begin identifying volunteers, companies that would volunteer to participate in this kind of a field study.
I understand, but that's 16 months later, and you're telling me it's still not complete.
Yeah, our data collection was completed this summer, and the report itself is now under peer review.
So when do you actually expect to complete that study? And so folks outside the agency can actually review the study. There's some questions about previous studies from your agency.
Yeah, well, I'd like to say the upcoming months. I know one of the members just said in spring. Ideally, we'll have it to you in the first quarter of the next calendar year.
Do you think it's effective to start the rule and then proceed with the study to determine whether it's really needed or not?
Well, again, the lab study on which the rule provision that's in question today is based is a very solid study, a 2-phase study, again, based on over a decade of sleep science analysis and discussion on this topic.
But the data on the truck crashes, how old is the data that's being used as the basis for this?
Well, we certainly used the large truck crash causation data.
And when is that from? Isn't that a decade old?
Yeah, that's correct.
10-year-old data.
Yeah.
And it still takes 16 months, still don't have this study done using 10-year-old data. Now, in that 10-year-old data, from, again, 2003, didn't it presume the baseline was, I think, 434,000 crashes per year. Is that correct?
Yes, and let's separate two separate things. The field study is not relying on any old data. The field study is relying on the conditions established in the congressional mandate under MAP 21. The 450,000 is a number that we used in some of the earlier research on the hours of service rule. That's correct.
And so the crash data you're using, though, is 10 years old.
Yes, and we have carried out an analysis moving forward using more current numbers that weren't in existence at the time we were developing this.
And is this analysis public?
Actually, we just completed it based on the criticism that came out, I think, this week from one of the trade associations.
The analysis
Yeah.
that you're is it public? Is it published, ma'am, or
I
is
will
it still
certainly
internal?
make it public for the record.
So an answer it has not been public as of today.
No, again, we just got the claim yesterday from one of the
Well, I know it's
associations.
taken you 10 years to update. I understand that takes time. I mean, you're using 10-year-old data. We have a 40% decrease in the crashes as part of this. And then it's taken you 16 months. You're still not done with the study. You still haven't released it at all. It's still internal. You don't know whether it's even going to, well, you're saying it's not even going to be released this year, sometime in the spring. And then you come here and tell us you know exactly what the impact is when you don't have the study. It's not been peer-reviewed, obviously. It's not been made public. I mean, this is what actually upsets my constituents. They understand the desire for safety, but they want it to be based on science.
That's right.
And ability to actually work with folks that are in the field, that do it every day, that drive a truck every day. And they're telling me this is not working, and it's not making sense. There have been independent studies that have confirmed that, in my opinion, and it's costing us money, and I think it's hurting, particularly our independents that are out there driving. And one last thing, I see another issue. National Pork Producers Council had proposed an exemption. Where is that at?
That is under consideration, and let's put that in two pieces. But I want to quickly back up and remind you again, you're combining data in two separate studies. The Washington State University lab study, on which the 34-hour restart is based, is a two-phase substantive lab study, peer-reviewed, and absolutely solid outcome based on decades of sleep science research, unrelated to the crash data that you were referring to, which was also part of the reg analysis, not part of the sleep science analysis. With regard to the exemption requests by the Pork Producer Council, yes, they in fact did submit a request for an exemption from the 30-minute break, having nothing to do with the restart. The agency, in recognizing that last year's summer heats were extreme, I granted a one-time 90-day waiver. I have the authority to do that, so that over the summer, from the time July 1 of this year, that the pork producers and the other livestock industries they were representing were operating had a break from the 30-minute requirement. They also submitted an exemption request for a full 2-year exemption from the 30-minute break. That's under review today.
And do you anticipate granting that, or what's your estimation?
I'll wait until, again, I agree with you. We are very focused on research, data-driven decisions in a very open process, and so I'll let the data and the research.
But the exemption request that you did grant, that was based on data?
That was a waiver request. That was not an exemption request. It was a 90-day waiver recognizing the impact that heat has on livestock and the extreme heats we had the summer before.
Well, there's extreme heats every summer. I'll note as well, ma'am, there's extreme cold as well. And as far as animal welfare, that is a very serious issue.
Yeah,
and so I appreciate your continued look at that, and I would ask you to extend that as well. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Understood. Thank you.
Thank you. What's clear to me is that this is a philosophy, an ideology, but not a solution to a problem. If you are indeed a data-driven organization, why is it that the study simply, what was the rush to this? And I agree that the 19 lives at that percentage is conjecture. And there's no one here, and I find it disquieting that you would even think anybody here would not consider each life important. That's not the point. The point is the cost-benefit analysis associated with this. In your testimony, you identified the economic benefit of the restart study rather than a benefit. A recent study found that the new restart rules has no net benefit. It will cost the industry up to $376 million, which you've heard. Additionally, a report compiled by the American Transportation Research Institute identified the changes to the HOS rule will have an operational impact on drivers' wages over the road totaling $1.6 billion to $3.9 billion in annualized losses. And what do you say to somebody actually in the business who didn't spend 2 days in a truck but spent a lifetime in a truck when she says the 1 to 5 a.m. has taken away the quality of life, reduced productivity, as well as this disruption of the drivers' normal sleep schedules, circadian rhythm, et cetera. And yet, you're supposed to be a data-driven organization. You know, a lot of this conversation isn't about the 34-hour rule. Nobody is objecting to that, but everyone, and myself, most people, I think, are objecting to the process and the arrogance associated with it. And I don't mean that personally. I mean that in general, that it is inflicting pain on people, and yet all we're really asking is that you prove your point. So why did you rush to this, if you agree that you did?
No, we absolutely did not, so I certainly don't agree to that last point.
I didn't kind of think that.
There is no rushing involved. I think, as the ranking member indicated in her opening statement, this is the hours of service conditions under which drivers operate are and will continue to be hotly discussed, because it impacts absolutely that driver's quality of life, that individual's ability to derive strong and successful and life-sustaining income, and it impacts small businesses. We recognize the impact on small business and on full aspects of the trucking industry of this rule in our analysis. It absolutely is data-based, research-based, fully vetted, unprecedented level of transparency throughout the development of this rule process, which we started in 2010. So in terms of being either theory-based or philosophy or arrogant, we have been as open.
Well, how can you say that when you don't take into consideration the change in the nature of the driver's workload? That you have actually, through this process, pushed someone into hours that are more convenient, less capable of moving around traffic because it's more congested, and yet you said yourself earlier you didn't take that into consideration. So how is that a holistic study in any way when that very thing is something that everybody's talking about? And why is the agency so numb to the industry whose number one concern is safety? There's not a person I've spoken to about this issue that doesn't agree that safety is the most important issue, especially in our very litigious society and the cost of workman's comp, et cetera. Yeah. And yet here we sit fighting back on a rule that the administration didn't even see fit to finish a study to at least patronize us. That's where I come up with the term arrogance.
Well, yeah, and I would deny both arrogance and numbness. We are as sensitized to this industry and drivers' conditions as any time in history when it comes to oversight of the truck industry. The fact of, when you start a rule and start a reg analysis, you look at the full population. Who is affected by it? Who comes under the oversight of this rule development itself and the hours of service rules? It's about 3 million drivers. And again, the hours of service rule itself that was put in place in 2003 has been litigated twice and a third time almost. So we really have only had uncertainty about this rule until today, now that the Circuit Court has upheld the rule that we put in place, and we finally got some certainty going forward. Again, it's a research and data-driven rule. Looking at, and part of that analysis in the rule development includes who's affected by what changes, and what's the cost of that, and what are the safety benefits. And we weigh all of that together. Congressman Rice earlier said, who's not affected by it? Well, again, almost 85% of the driving population continues to operate because the vast majority, in ATA's own submittal during the rulemaking process, the vast majority of their members' drivers and drivers across the country run between 45 and 50 hours a week on average. They never need the restart.
No, but that doesn't necessarily justify the restart for the other percentage.
There are always trade-offs, and there are people impacted by this rule. There are people who were impacted by an 80-hour week, week after week after week. That's double time. That's what could be averaged under the prior rule without this restart. That has a level of health impact on drivers. Chronic fatigue has an impact on blood pressure, has an impact on diabetes.
And how do you respond to Prospect Transportation, the lady whose letter I wrote? What do you say to her when she's telling you just the opposite, and she actually sees these people every day?
Yeah.
And I don't want to sit here and say she's being disingenuous. I believe these people. And frankly, they're okay with the 34-hour rule that from 2003. They're comfortable. They've learned to live with it. And you said yourself it's been litigated a couple of times. But they find this excessive, unproven, and Congress, under MAP 21, did ask to have a study completed. It was supposed to be done, last time we met, it was supposed to be done, I think, September 31st. Now we're saying it's spring. I mean, how do you expect people to be comfortable, respectfully, with a decision that looks that just the nature of it looks, frankly, sloppy?
Yeah, I would like, with your agreement, of course, I would like to follow up with your constituent and talk with her about how they are applying the rules. It is clear from the work, again, we've been on the radio several times every month since long before the enactment of this rule, to, again, listen to drivers' questions. We're all across the country talking. We've got logbook examples on our website. I'd very much like to follow up and find out how she's applying it, because in many cases, we are finding that there's a misunderstanding in this restart. So many drivers do not need it. They're telling their own safety managers they don't need it, and safety managers are saying, yes, you do. Because, again, it's a voluntary tool to reset a clock, but if the clock doesn't need resetting, you don't need to get into that condition.
But a lot of people find themselves there. I'll yield to Ranking Member Meng. Thank you.
Thank you. The number of people killed in large truck and bus-related crashes has declined by about 29% between 2000 and 2011. What do you think was the main reason for this decline?
It's a combination. Again, safety comes about through very intense effort by a wide range of folks, by industry, by government, state, local, federal, by enforcement, by safety advocates, by the businesses that purchase the services of that trucking sector, and generally a recognition, again, that safety is a very solid bottom line number when you've got safety as a top priority. And so together, technology investment, improved analysis of the carriers that are operating unsafely and actions against them, tougher authorities that Congress has given us over the past few years, all of those efforts combined continue, and we will continue to work together to drive that number down and save lives.
How significant of a problem is driver fatigue amongst truckers today, and what role does it continue to play in bus crash fatalities?
Yeah. Our analysis, both that we used in the rule as well as what we have spoken to in many ways, comes about through several different data sets, including the large truck crash causation study. In our rule development and evaluation, we used a range from 7% to 13% and analyzed the costs and benefits using both pieces of data.
What research and data has FMCSA used to support this conclusion of, truck crash, this conclusion?
The conclusion on the fatigue-related research, again, it goes back to the very individualized analysis of each of the crashes in that large truck crash causation study. We've also carried out surveys of drivers. OMB must approve surveys, but in the past, in one survey in particular, a significant number and percentage of drivers, certainly better than 30%, identified that they did in fact drive tired and had had an experience of, sort of a brief moment of sleep at the wheel. And those are through surveys. That wasn't pre-crash, but that was absolute, more than anecdotal.
Besides fatigue, are there any other factors that contribute to these types of crashes?
There are a wide range of factors that contribute to crashes: speeding, aggressive lane changing, unsafe braking, or other equipment, inadequate visibility, the actions of the passenger vehicle or other vehicle operating around, and the need for that driver, the professional driver, to take evasive action. There are a whole series of weather. There are many contributors, but again, the more significant contributors, the highest contributor is going to be speed. And any other action that could contribute to the inability to respond quickly, such as fatigue, if someone is going too fast for conditions and they come upon a line of traffic, is going to compound the result of that crash.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you. How do you respond to the truckers in the room then? And basically you're saying they're wrong and you're right, that the rule will help them. They don't think it does. According to recent study survey of the CMV operations and carriers, more than 80% of the carriers report significant impact on their operations as a result of changes the agency has made to the 34-hour restart. You say it's 15%. You know, and how do you respond to criticisms from small business trucking operators? The new hours of service regulations actually increase fatigue. I mean, I'm just.
What do I say?
What do you say?
Well, you know, first I start with separating those two data points that you talked about, the 80% and the impact on income. The survey, there are two things that ATRI released this week, which is part of the American Trucking Associations. It included a logbook analysis that identified that less than a third of 1% of the drivers' logbooks showed any change in hours of operation, but pre-rule and post-July 1 of this year. So that was the, you know, sort of hard, just clear and cut data from logbooks. A separate piece that derived that 80% is a survey that's sort of one of those kind of vote early, vote often concept, an online survey that they solicited their members to respond to. I would be happy to understand what is behind that survey. That is what I have not seen from them yet. But again, we take this very seriously. It is important to recognize that this rule and the prior hour service rule does impact some drivers' pay, and it absolutely impacts small businesses and in some cases large businesses. Detention time, inadequate compensation, 36 cents a mile for a driver running 70 hours a week is just unconscionable.
Well, you're not
That's the
proposing
average
that
pay.
you're not sitting here telling people that I mean, that's the market. You know, that's got nothing to do with this issue.
Well,
Why do you even mention that? I mean, if you're going to criticize people for what they're paying, I can appreciate that, but that's not the point. We're saying that you're actually making it worse for the very people that you're saying you want to help.
No, I mention it because the survey in question asked drivers about their pay and had it been impacted pre or post. So again, the logbook analysis says no change. Drivers being solicited or whoever responded to the survey is saying big change in my income. So, and in terms of loss. So absolutely, it's very important to understand what's behind that data. We'd be happy to look at it more closely and discuss it and provide our analysis for the record.
Are you open to rolling this rule back and waiting to the survey?
No, absolutely not. This rule is a solid rule. It's been upheld by the court. It's based on sound research. However, there continue to be and should continue to be a discussion about the hours of service and continued sensitivity to the challenges that a lack of predictability imposes on a driver in the context of a set of hours. And so we are pursuing a pilot project that combines the results of some split-sleep research we did that we finished after this rule went into effect, and the electronic logging device rule that we are also eager to press forward on, but take advantage of those two pieces. We don't have to wait for the LD rule to be complete to analyze the benefits of trying to get towards this question of improved flexibility while maintaining our effective safety oversight.
So
the discussion
if you find out you're wrong, you're saying that you're open to changing it because you're studying things but you've already enacted a rule. So I guess I find that a little odd.
Well, I hope I can continue to explain to you how, in fact, it is absolutely to be expected and a solid approach that an agency drives a very transparent discussion on a rule that has this level of an effect, you know, on folks, on at least 15% of the driving population, but not the other 85. Yeah.
Mr. Rice?
Thank you, sir. I've got information here in front of me. I guess this survey is talking about from the American Transportation Research Institute. Says that more than 80% of motor carriers surveyed had experienced productivity loss since the new rules went into effect. 67% of drivers report decreases in pay since the rules took effect. Drivers' wages for all over-the-road drivers fell by a total of $1.6 billion to $3.9 billion in annualized loss. These findings concern you at all?
Yeah, and that's, in fact, I was just speaking with the chairman about that. That's correct. And when you separate that data, again, as part of ATRI's work on this issue, they also analyzed drivers' logs and found that the drivers' logs, the hours they worked pre-July 1 and the hours they worked post-July 1, changed nary a bit,
So
but
you're
a third of
saying
1%.
Saying that you don't necessarily agree with the results of this study.
Their survey, again, I would describe, until I can see what the basis of it is, as sort of a vote early, vote often type of survey. I have no idea who actually was contributing that survey information.
All right. Now, this rule, does it apply to short haul drivers?
The 30-minute break requirement does not. The remainder of the rule
why
certainly
doesn't it?
does. The 30-minute break requirement?
Yeah.
Again, the D.C. Circuit Court, as I said, upheld the majority of the substance of this rule, but did strike down the element of the 30-minute break requirement on the short-haul industry.
Okay. So the court found that this rule was overexpansive, at least in that respect.
That's correct, on the 30-minute
Okay.
piece, for short haul, yes.
And so people like, people driving bread trucks in the morning, people driving cement trucks, and these people that they're in and out of their truck all day long, it's not like they got driving fatigue, right?
And that would appear to be the nature, certainly, of why we have special conditions for short haul to begin with in that 150-mile radius, as well as the court's decision on the 30-minute break.
So you're saying these overnight rules don't apply to the short haul drivers?
No, the 30-minute break is the only piece that the court struck down.
So
The
the
remainder of the
overnight
rule
rules do
absolutely
apply
does
to
apply.
short haul drivers?
Absolutely. And again, they generally don't need them because they don't work beyond a 60-hour week.
Then why do they apply to them at all? I mean, it's ridiculous in my mind. These people aren't suffering from driving fatigue. They're in and out of their trucks all day long. These people driving concrete trucks, they can't drive very far.
Yeah.
The concrete will get hard. Asphalt trucks, they can't drive very far. And then when they get to where they're going, they sit and wait till they can dump their load, and then they drive for 30 minutes more. The idea that this rule would apply to them is just absurd. This idea from the federal bureaucracy that you're going to throw a wet blanket over everybody and wait till a lawsuit comes and tells you who it can't apply to is just absolutely absurd. And particularly with a half-baked thing that the study's not even complete, and you can't even tell if you're right whether or not it's going to have any effect because the result is so small in terms of the benefit, but the cost is so great.
Yes, and it's interesting you say that the hours of service rule that applies to the short haul industry is virtually identical to the rule that's been in place since 2003. And again, because those operators very rarely exceed 60 hours a week, and they already, under the short haul conditions, have the ability to extend the workday, that driving window, to 16 hours from the normal 14 during certain times of the week or a couple times a week. They already operate under conditions that have not changed under this rule. Again, hours of service for the trucking industry is the purview of the Secretary of Transportation. It's not subject to the Fair Labor Standards Act. So anybody that's operating a commercial vehicle that comes under the oversight of the DOT is going to be subject to some sort of an hours of service requirement, and that set of requirements on short haul operators is virtually unchanged.
Well, I think that what we've got here is we had a rule in place that had reduced traffic deaths, fatalities, accidents by truckers by 29%, I think is what Ms. Ming said, and that we've done a study with 27 graduate students in Washington, and determined that maybe, possibly, we might be able to save 18 people, but we're not going to know because the sample's so small, and we're willing to impose the federal government on all these small businesses across the country and have them incur this loss, where we've got 67% of drivers reporting pay decreases, 80% of motor carrier providing productivity loss. We haven't even finished the study. I do think it's arrogance. I absolutely think it's arrogance. I think we need to rethink. We need to reset. We need to at least finish our study and figure out if we're basing this on the right conclusions. So I thank you for appearing today. I hope you will reconsider. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Tippin?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I'd like to follow up just a little bit on a couple of the comments that you'd made, Administrator. In your response to the Chairman, you said that you were sensitized to the industry concerns.
Absolutely.
And Mr. Rice was just noting 80% of the motor carriers surveyed experience productivity loss. Majority of drivers, 67%, report decreases in pay since the rule took effect. And I think it's important to note these aren't oftentimes big businesses. The big company owner is the guy driving the truck or the woman driving the truck. So you're sensitized to that. Do you understand the frustration of one-size-fits-all being thrown over an industry.
Absolutely. I think that's been a frustration that has prevailed for the hours of service rules for many, many years. It absolutely predates this rule. It is the.
So we're adding another rule that is one size fits all?
No. The same rule is virtually intact. It's a 14-hour driving window and 11-hour drive time. It provides for a restart for those that need to reset their clock, and the vast majority do not. The survey in question, I think, surveyed about 3,000 drivers. Again, we don't know who they were or the integrity behind that process. I am happy to provide our analysis of that survey for the record. But again,
you mentioned 3,000. I'm just
Yeah.
curious. How many drivers are there in the country?
Roughly 3 million affected by this rule.
3 million.
But more than that, certainly operate in intrastate operations or smaller vehicle operations that aren't keeping records of duty.
And just for my clarification, of these 3,000, was this nationwide in the sample survey?
I do not know. I think whoever is responsible for that survey, it was an industry survey, could be able to answer that, I hope.
Okay. You know, and I think this begs back to the chairman's point, that we're implementing a rule. It isn't completed. We don't know if it was broad-reaching in terms of the different regions by your own admission right now, but we're forging ahead with a rule that is going to impact real lives, real businesses, and could have some very dramatic effects. And I appreciate you being here. I understand, and we all, again, share the compassion of wanting to make sure that we're safe. I happen to know some of the guys driving the trucks.
Yeah.
They want to be safe, too.
Yeah, they do.
But they want to earn a living, too. And they're seeing the federal government stepping in with a broad-based, one-size-fits-all across the nation policy on an uncompleted study with a small sample size that can really impact them. And I hope you can understand that frustration that's there. And, Mr. Chairman, if I may, I think this speaks broadly to a bill that we passed through the House of Representatives called the REINS Act, to where we can actually get Congress involved back into the rulemaking process. Because I have to tell you, as a member of Congress, came from the state of Colorado, we have sunset legislation to where we can review rulemaking. And to be able to actually bring in those real-life stories and those real-life impacts. And I think this REINS Act is something I'd encourage the United States Senate to take up, because as well-intentioned as you are, I think there are some real impacts that aren't really being taken into consideration here. And when I was in business, before we made a decision, we had the final product to be able to make the best decision.
Well, look, the safety of the American people is something we take into consideration utmost. That's why this agency was created. Safety of the industry, health of the driver, ultimately safety of the American people. The number of fatalities, even taking your earlier example of what if it's something closer to 25% or 30% that are caused by the truck driver. You're talking 2 to 3 747s. 2 to 3 747s crashing every year. You wouldn't tolerate it. The American people wouldn't tolerate it. We continue to press forward with balanced rulemaking, research-driven, data-based. The study you asked me about as to, in terms of its nationwide impact is an ATRI study. That is not FMCSA study. It's, the numbers you quote were something that was just released this week. The data and research behind this rule were fully vetted, fully peer-reviewed, fully available to stakeholders to comment on. This has been a more transparent process than ever before. This is a rule that's been upheld by the court. We now have certainty in the hours of service, which we have not had since the ICC Termination Act directed the agency to revisit truck drivers' hours of service rule because of fatigue and its impact on crash likelihood and safety.
Sure. And Congress is still asked to have a study completed.
And we will complete it.
Well, I don't know that the intent is clearly that the study be completed before the rules enacted. And I'd like to note for the record that the agency, unless I'm mistaken, has not made your methodology of its economic analysis public.
Oh, well.
Is that out there?
Absolutely, it's out there.
All right.
Yep. We've got a full docket with lots of explanation.
Can you send that along then?
I will be pleased to send that along.
Thank you. I want to thank you for being here today.
Yes, sir.
And members of Congress may have additional questions, so if you do, I just ask that you submit them in writing. As you can tell by the TV, we have votes, so we're going to adjourn to go to the floor. I would guess that we'll be back here by noon. So if And I'd invite you to stay if you like.
Thank you.
If you feel so inclined, and hear from the industry themselves and get the counterpoint. But I also understand that you may have to go.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We'll see you at around noon. And Ms. Mang is coming back, so hopefully she'll be here shortly. But I'm going to, in the interest of time, just proceed. Thank you all for appearing today. I'd like now to introduce the first witness of the second panel, Mr. Dwayne Long. Mr. Long is chairman of Logistics, a small business freight hauling operation located in Raleigh, North Carolina. Mr. Long started his business with one truck in 1984. Since then, he has built his business into 45 truck operation, employing over 105 people. He is testifying on behalf of the American Trucking Association. Mr. Long, thank you, and thank your wife for being here today. You may proceed, sir.
Chairman Hanna and members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity. ATA is the largest trade association for the trucking industry. Through its affiliated associations, the ATA Federation represents more than 30,000 members covering every type of carrier. I am Dwayne Long, chairman of Logistics, a trucking and logistics company in North Carolina that my wife and I started in 1984. We operate an average of 45 trucks and employ an average of 105 drivers who provide service for pharmaceutical customers throughout the United States. We take pride in our outstanding safety performance. Mr. Chairman and Representative Rice, thank you for introducing H.R. 3413. ATA fully supports the bill. Simply put, the hours of service changes were unnecessary. FMCSA's action, while perhaps well-intentioned, was not based on evidence or analyses demonstrating a problem with the prior set of rules. These new rules are having real-world impacts on thousands of small trucking companies and the million-plus drivers that work for them. Keep in mind, 97% of trucking companies are small businesses with 20 trucks or less. This past Monday, the 18th, the American Transportation Research Institute, called ATRI, issued a new report on the impacts of these rules based on two separate surveys conducted in September and October. The first collected data from more than 2,300 professional truck drivers, and the second survey yielded responses from more than 400 truck fleets, 70% of which were small fleets. ATRI also analyzed electronic logbook data from more than 40,000 drivers over a 93-day period after July 1. ATRI's findings are groundbreaking and remarkably timely for this hearing. ATRI found that 67.4% of surveyed drivers reported a drop in their income since July the 1st. The aggregate annual loss is between $1.6 billion and $3.9 billion spread across a million-plus over-the-road truck drivers. 82.5% of drivers indicated a somewhat negative or very negative impact on their quality of life. Ironically, 66% perceived increases in fatigue since these rules went into effect. More than 80% of fleets surveyed indicated a loss of productivity, and counter to FMCSA's claims, electronic logbook data does not support the agency's claims of drivers consistently working excessive hours. I can confirm these findings. My drivers work reasonable hours, yet they have lost productivity. Bottom line, these rules are having a widespread negative impact on productivity for drivers and fleets. A few specifics about my company. We employ team drivers, typically husbands and wives, who take turns driving the truck and one resting in the truck's sleeper berth. Their weekly routine often keeps them on the road until around 2 a.m. early Saturday morning. Under the previous restart rule, they could depart on their next trip Sunday evening after being off more than a day and a half in order to make a Monday morning delivery required by our customers. Now, when taking the restart, they cannot depart until after 5 a.m. on Monday and are unable to meet the customer's expectations and the demands of just-in-time delivery. Other small fleets have shared similar concerns with ATA. Because restarts must now include this 1 to 5 a.m. period, many trucks are entering the traffic flow at about the same time, just as rush hour begins. A regional food transporter based in Minnesota that ATA has heard from experienced a loss in productivity per truck of between 4% and 6%. Their drivers are frustrated and so are the customers, as late deliveries have doubled over the past 3 months. ATA has heard similar problems and concerns from many companies, both small and large. More importantly, ATRI has documented the widespread nature of these problems and their huge cost. More troubling is these new rules are not likely to result in any kind of meaningful benefit. Not surprisingly, FMCSA has announced no plans to collect data in an effort to determine if the benefits are possible. We did not hear any plans to that effect today. We encourage Congress to pass H.R. 3413 to stay the restart provision until GAO completes an assessment of FMCSA's cost-benefit work and its restart field study. This is not just a trucking issue. The rule changes are having negative impacts throughout the supply chain and explains why the National Association of Manufacturers, National Federation of Small Businesses, and more than 50 other organizations are supporting H.R. 3413. Again, thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you. Our next witness is Mr. Tilden Curl. Mr. Curl is a single-unit owner-operator from Olympia, Washington. He has more than 20 years of experience in the industry. In addition, Mr. Curl was recently recognized as the 28th Annual Goodyear Highway Hero. He received this distinction for risking his own life to save a motorist whose disabled vehicle was almost hit by a train. He is testifying today on behalf of the Owner-Operator Independent Drivers Association. Mr. Curl, thank you for being here. And I want to tell you, I'm a 35-year member of the Operating Engineers, so we share a similar history.
We do. Thank you very much. Sir. Good morning. My name is Tilden Curl. I'm from Olympia, Washington, and I have been a professional driver for over 20 years. I currently operate throughout 7 western states and appreciate the opportunity to testify on behalf of the Owner-Operator Independent Drivers Association. OOIDA represents the small business truckers that are the majority of the U.S. trucking industry. More than 90% of carriers own 20 trucks or less. Half of all trucking companies are one-truck operations. Small business truckers are committed to highway safety. For us, accidents have an adverse impact on our businesses and our livelihoods. OOIDA's average member has a quarter-century of experience and more than 2 million miles of accident-free driving. I want to thank Administrator Farrell, who recently saw our commitment to safety and some of the challenges truckers face every day as she joined an OOIDA board member on a 2-day ride-along from D.C. to St. Louis. As professional drivers, we need flexibility to balance countless demands. Loss of flexibility has an economic impact for small business truckers, and over time, changes to the hours of service regulations have reduced that flexibility. Less flexibility makes it more difficult to stop for rest, avoid traffic, and keep a schedule after being delayed by a shipper or receiver. The recent hours of service rulemaking, which was the result of a court settlement, was an opportunity to help truckers balance these countless demands. Unfortunately, the changes went in the opposite direction, adding new restrictions to the 34-hour restart, requiring an arbitrary 30-minute break, and retaining the unstoppable 14-hour duty clock. The impacts of these changes are borne out in a recent survey of OOIDA's membership. While only 3% said they felt less fatigued, 46% of respondents felt more fatigued after the changes. 79% have seen impacts in their ability to use the restart. 65% responded that they have lost some income, and more than half experienced reduced loads and mileage. My own experience has mirrored these responses, especially with the 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. periods during the restart. This often puts me in the middle of Seattle's rush hour, and much like D.C.'s Beltway traffic, this means more time on the road at a greater risk of accidents. For these reasons, OOIDA supports H.R. 3413, Mr. Hannon and Mr. Rice's legislation that will ensure a full examination of the 34-hour restart restrictions. As it is now, the restart restrictions could reduce my potential work week by as much as 1 day, possibly costing me as much as $4,000 to $5,000 a month. While some would argue technology is the safety solution, OOIDA's members see this as a false premise and a way to ignore larger issues. This rings true when accident data shows that carriers who depend on technology, such as onboard recorders and speed limiters, crash twice as frequently as carriers who use experienced and safe owner-operators. With this in mind, what should be done? FMCSA itself can act by returning flexibility to the hours of service, including allowing truckers to pause the duty clock with rest breaks. Trucking, government, and most importantly, shippers and receivers must address the detention issue. Professional truckers, while still considered unskilled labor, deserve to have their time fully, fairly compensated. We must stop placing more rigid requirements on the driver while allowing carriers and customers to make demands beyond the allowances of regulations and safety. FMCSA must act on an entry-level driver training and driver trainer requirements as the foundation of a healthy safety program. Advancing this policy, first called for by Congress in 1991, is OOIDA's top safety priority. Our comprehensive driver training proposal forms the keystone of our Truckers for Safety agenda. You can learn more about this at truckersforsafety.com. In closing, bringing our complete supply chain in as partners to address the regulatory responsibilities of truckers is the right direction to take. Further, FMCSA should prioritize providing additional flexibility while addressing core needs like entry-level driver training. The wrong direction is to rely on further restrictions and unproven technology. Thank you for the opportunity to testify and for holding today's hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Curl. Our next witness is Mr. Brian Evans. Mr. Evans is President and CEO of L&L Freight Services, a 12-employee transportation brokerage located in Cabot, Kansas, Arkansas. Prior to joining the freight brokerage business, Mr. Cabot was an over-the-road trucker. He is testifying today on behalf of the Transportation Intermediaries Association. Mr. Evans, you may deliver your testimony.
Thank you, sir. Chairman Hanna, Ranking Member Ming, members of the House Small Business Committee, thank you for this opportunity to speak with you today regarding concerns affecting small businesses arising from the FMCSA hours of service rules. As mentioned, my name is Brian Evans. I am the owner of a small transportation brokerage company. I serve as the President and CEO of L&L Freight Services out of Cabot, Arkansas. I am a 20-year veteran of the transportation, freight brokerage, and supply chain management sector. I do come from a family-owned, blue-collar small business. Prior to working in the brokerage industry, I drove over the road for almost 1 million accident-free miles. Additionally, I currently serve on the TIA Board of Directors. TIA represents 1,400 member companies, 70% of which are small family-owned businesses. Like the FMCSA, one of our primary missions is promoting safe practices. As an organization, we seek to work with FMCSA to make the hours of service regulations the best possible tool to improve safety for the motoring public by reducing truck driver fatigue. Unfortunately, the new hours of service regulations were a solution in search of a problem. No one wants unsafe trucks or drivers on the road. To that end, we have a standing committee that is published and regularly updates a carrier selection framework. The TIA recommends that every broker and every shipper have in place a written carrier selection policy for hiring carriers. Safety improvements by the industry under the previous hours of service rules reduced accidents. It allowed the market to become more efficient and allowed American business to be more competitive. The new rules, however, are overly complicated, will reduce productivity, and have no effect on reducing accidents beyond the previous level. In the 24th Annual State of Logistics Report authored by Rosalind Wilson, she estimates that a loss of productivity close to 6% for the transportation industry. This is a significant amount in loss of productivity that could lead companies to expand their nearshoring ventures into neighboring countries, thus relocating valued American transportation jobs to foreign nations. I have spoken with many of my carrier customers who are experiencing a major loss of productivity due to the new restart provision. This rule is resulting in around 5 fewer loads per week, or a reduction of 3% in capacity for their fleets. The cost of this loss of efficiency is felt by the business and ultimately will be passed on to each of us, the consumer. We are not suggesting that increased safety be traded for increased efficiency. We are stating that safety improvement was achieved under the old rules and that the new rules will not result in dramatically increased carrier safety. As you know, there is a pressing shortage of drivers across America. The new hours of service rules will have a twofold effect. First, it will chase out qualified drivers and deter future motor carriers from entering the industry, because the rules limit the number of loads that a carrier can handle each week. The rule will also likely require drivers to operate during peak hours of peak hours of operations, thereby increasing congestion and, as a result, reducing safety. The American Transportation Research Institute recently released their 2013 edition, Critical Issues in the Trucking Industry. The report places the new hours of service regulations as this year's top concern for the transportation industry. ATRI estimates that the changes to the restart provision alone would cost the industry $189 million, as opposed to the $133 million benefit that is projected by the FMCSA. The FMCSA's concerns about driver health and safety are to be applauded. The TIA supports the passage of H.R. 3413, the True Safety Act. TIA urges the agency to examine the negative effects of the 34-hour restart provision and to consider amending the rule to give transportation the flexibility that they need to ensure safety. I appreciate very much this opportunity to testify before the subcommittee today on the concerns of the new HOS rules and the effects that it has on businesses like mine, whether a third-party logistics provider, a motor carrier, or the entire supply chain. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. Ranking Member Meng will be introducing our next witness.
Dr. Paul Giovannis is a professor of civil engineering at Penn State University and has over 34 years of experience in highway safety and traffic engineering. At Penn State, he is also the director of the Transportation Operations Program at the Larson Transportation Institute. He has extensive expertise in the area of driver fatigue and motor carrier safety and has published frequently on these subjects. Prior to coming to Penn State in 1997, he was a professor and associate director of the Institute of Transportation Studies at the University of California, Davis. Thank you for being here.
Chairman Hanna, Ranking Member Meng, and committee members, thank you for the privilege of sharing and participating in this hearing. Understanding the relationship between truck driving hours of service and crashes is a complex and challenging task. Researchers working in this area come from backgrounds as diverse as human factors, psychology, medicine, and road safety. Some of the research in this field has been described by the term, quote, fatigue, even though questions have been raised in the literature about the definition of the term fatigue itself. Others have focused on studying the association of crashes to the duration of driving, rest breaks, scheduling of driving over several days, and time of day. All of these approaches contribute in different ways to our accumulation of knowledge about hours of service and crashes. This testimony is not an exhaustive review of this literature, as there would likely be hundreds of citations. Rather, this is an attempt to summarize the most recent work in the field with a few additional references to well-cited research. Concerning the effect of hours of service on crashes, I offer the following summary. Hours of continuous driving. Using data supplied by carriers over a period of more than 20 years, there have been a number of studies that support the basic principle that the longer one drives, the greater the odds of a crash. And you see the references in the testimony. These 8 studies estimated the effective driving time, importantly, when controlling for other factors such as experience, off-duty time, driving pattern over multiple days, and in one case, time of day directly. These studies are among the few that control for multiple factors while seeking to estimate the effective driving time. A study using fatal truck-involved crashes from 1980 to 2002 also indicated an increase in crash risk with hours driving. Using trucks instrumented with cameras and other vehicle-based sensors, a series of studies have been conducted to connect risky driving maneuvers to hours of service. Using these measures, one study found little connection between the observed events and hours driving. A second study with more extensive data did find an association of driving time with the occurrence of safety-critical events, including a few crashes. This second study, like the first, also showed a close correlation with time on duty. Other studies using regular work conditions have found little association of these metrics with hours driving. In summary, based on a series of studies using carrier-supplied data and one with fatal truck crashes measured over 20 years, I believe there is evidence that crash risk increases as driving time increases. Concerning hours off duty, the increase in required off-duty time was implemented in 2003. Crash-based research using data from the 1980s indicates that drivers with more than 9 hours off duty had a lower crash risk when returning to work than drivers with 8 to 9 hours off duty. This is a case where the change in regulations, increasing off-duty time from 8 to 10 hours, is consistent with the research. Concerning time of day, the effects of time of day are particularly difficult to identify because trucks share the road with other traffic, which has marked peaks in urban areas during the morning and evening rush. In a study using crash data with a baseline of 10 a.m. to noon, crash risks were elevated in the early morning, 4 a.m. to 6 a.m., through about 10 a.m., and then again from 4 to 10 p.m. Another study found an increase in the odds of a crash from 11 p.m. through 6 a.m. Using fatigue tests and instrumented vehicle data, others found strong association of declines in performance in fatigue tests linked to time of day. Fatigue, self-rated by the drivers, increased more during night than day shifts in a study in Australia. So time of day is associated with crash risk. The question is how to best address this in regulations. Rest breaks. Breaks are included in the hours of service rules for the European Union, which require 45 minutes for each 4.5 hours of driving. In 2013, the new U.S. rule required a 30-minute rest break before 8 hours of driving. Lack of mandatory inclusion in this policy allowed researchers to compare drivers with the break and those without. The presence of 2 breaks reduced crash odds by 30% in a 2011 study. The safety benefits of rest breaks seem overwhelming. Cumulative driving over several days. The introduction of the 34-hour restart in 2003 has triggered a series of studies of the effect of cumulative driving both with and without a restart. 2 laboratory studies have been recently completed that focus on the 34-hour restart. In the first, subjects were split into 2 groups, one working a daytime schedule for 5 days, off duty for 34 hours, then working 5 more days, 5 more 14-hour days. The second group had a similar schedule, except the participants worked at night for 5 days, had a 34-hour day-oriented break, and then another 5 days of night work. The principal finding is that the day-oriented work group showed no decline in performance, while those with the night work showed a decline when they returned to work after the 34-hour restart. These studies were enhanced in a follow-up experiment in which participants were subjected to night work periods separated by a 58-hour restart, aimed at emulating the effect of an additional day on top of the 34-hour regulation. In this case, drivers were compared against each other before and after the restart. The longer restart resulted in no performance degradation after return from a 58-hour off-duty period. This concludes my oral testimony. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you. Ranking Member Mang.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the courtesy. Question for Dr. Giovannis. The new HOS rule does not restore the allowable driving time to 10 hours. What is the effect of an extra hour of driving time on driver fatigue and truck accident rates?
Well, I guess I could answer most directly by saying all the evidence that we have and all the work that we've done for over 20 years are that increasing from 10 to 11 hours increases the likelihood of crashes. The curve goes up. We don't do work with the term fatigue, so I'll just answer the question in terms of crashes. Increasing from 9 to 10, changing from 9 hours to 10 hours increases the risk. Going from 10 hours to 11 hours increases the risk of a crash.
And a question for Mr. Curl. FMCSA claimed that truck drivers' health will benefit substantially from the new rule. They asserted that more time off results in more sleep. What is your view of this assessment? Does more time off necessarily mean more sleep for drivers?
No, it really doesn't. To address the issue of fatigue, you need to take rest or take sleep at times when your body's ready for it. You can't legislate sleep or rest from anything other than the cab of a truck. I would like to weigh in a little bit on your recent question regarding fatigue and the difference in the hours of driving. I believe there was an ATRI study that was done once that showed that the greatest risk was actually in the first hour of driving rather than in the last hour of driving, which almost mirrored the danger. The danger in the 11th hour was almost as high, but not quite as high as the first hour. So also fatigue or asleep truck drivers were a factor in 1.8% of all truck involved fatality accidents, 64 accidents total in 2011.
Thank you. Same to Mr. Curl. As a small business owner, most trucking firms are small businesses. As a small business owner, how easy would it be to hire additional drivers and buy new trucks to make up for lost productivity caused by the hours of service rule?
Hiring more trucks is not going to be the solution because each and every truck has to be profitable on and of itself. So, hiring another truck to make up for it is, I don't know, it's not going to address the real underlying issue, the real issue. And actually, hours of service does have a huge impact on what we do. But it is one of several issues that we face in the industry. Truthfully, detention time has a greater impact on what we do than the hours of service.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Rice?
Mr. Jovanis, do you think that the proposed rule will have a meaningful impact on accidents and injuries? Yes or no?
I don't know. I don't know because I haven't
Thank
studied
you, sir.
this.
Mr. Evans, do you think it will?
No, sir, I do not.
Mr. Curl?
No.
Mr. Long?
No, sir, I do not.
Thank you. Mr. Curl, you hit on something that I think is important. You said that drivers need flexibility, and it appears to me that, the federal bureaucratic framework, not just related to truckers or transportation or anything else, the problem with it is that we try to write these rules that apply to everybody, and you can't do it in a logical way that it does apply to everybody. When you say flexibility, I mean, if you get held up by a supplier and you have to have your load to a certain place and you were planning on driving the next day, but now you're going to be thrown in the day after and you got to restart in the middle, it might force you to drive when you're tired, correct?
Absolutely.
So actually these rules could force you into a situation that you would normally think was unsafe, correct?
That's correct.
Can you be more descriptive of a situation like that than I could? Because I'm not a driver. Can you help me with that?
Well, I can, but you have to understand that in the trucking industry, we're such a diverse industry that there's, of all the types of operations that we have, several of them are alike maybe, but the majority of them are individual by nature. So flexibility comes in addressing the issues of each particular operation. In my particular operation, if I could leave my house at, say, 4 in the morning and get through Seattle before the rush hour traffic hits, it would be great. But that violates my 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. periods that's required for the 34-hour restart. I mean, that's one example of flexibility.
Mr. Long, do you think that these rules could force truck drivers to drive in a fatigue situation when they otherwise wouldn't?
I would hope not, but Mr. Curl gave an example, I think, where it could possibly happen. We wouldn't do that at my company. We would make sure our drivers were always safe, but that could happen given the example that Mr. Curl gave.
Mr. Giovannis, you mentioned that you mentioned a number of studies that seem to have differing conclusions. On one hand, you said hours of driving didn't have a meaningful impact on, what did you say? You said longer drive times didn't necessarily give a greater chance of accidents. Isn't that what you said?
I don't think so.
Okay.
But let me try to clarify.
All right.
One of the complicating factors in this area is that different studies have had different findings. So the studies done, sponsored by FMCSA in 2003 and 2004 by Virginia Tech, did not find an association of driving time with what they called safety critical events.
That's almost unbelievable to me. So they're saying you could drive for 48 hours straight and not have a higher chance of an accident?
Well, given the data that they collected over, say, a 14-hour period of work, they saw no difference from the first hour to the 14th hour. It was uniform in terms of the rate at which bad driving or errors were occurring.
You also said that the chances of an accident increase in the morning and in the evening.
Right.
And I presume you're talking about rush hour times.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Do you know if the study that's been done by whatever the acronym is, FMCA or whatever it is, takes into account, I know they're aimed at fatigue, and they think that by keeping people off the road from 1 to 5 lowers fatigue, and that lowers the chance of an accident. Do you know if it takes into account the increased risk that you're talking about of forcing drivers to drive in that rush hour time?
Well, they funded some of my work. So the more recent report that you have in the testimony from 2011 is funded by FMCSA, and we use crash data. The FMCSA chooses a number of different sort of scientific mechanisms to do these things. So
you don't know whether it takes that into account or not?
My studies did. I don't know the extent to which the other studies.
So you did a study that analyzed fatigue and determined that people were less fatigued if they had these two periods of time in the early morning. When I say 1 to 5, isn't that the time that they're requiring to have off? They're less fatigued if they do that rather than under the current rule. Is that right?
I wouldn't use the word fatigue. The reference that I gave in the testimony was that if they're driving in the early morning hours from, say, 4 a.m. to about 10 a.m., then they have a higher risk of a crash.
But under the rule as proposed, aren't we forcing drivers into those hours? Yes, clearly we are. Yes, we are.
Let me say this. What has surprised me about this particular set of rules is it's the first time that the agency has specified particular times a day when people have to be off duty. If you look at the regulations prior to that, we talked about flexibility on the panel. They've never specified a particular time of day when you had to be off duty. This is the first time that they've done that.
But under this current rule, or under the proposed rule, or whatever, it's in effect already. They're off the road from 1 to 5, right?
If they want to use the restart, they have to be off the road for two consecutive days.
Which increases the likelihood that they're going to be on the road from 5 to whenever, correct?
Well, I would presume that, but I don't know that in fact.
And you're saying that your studies show that from 5 to 10, there's an increased chance of accidents, correct?
That's right.
So we're forcing them into a time when they're more prone to accidents.
Well, like I said, I don't know that for a fact, so I'd be uncomfortable saying that directly as you. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Let me say it directly then. What we heard was, Doctor, I really appreciate I've read your testimony in advance. I appreciate the openness with which you presented it here today and the way it's written. What we know, though, is that the study, the proposed study, and the process that they went through for the rulemaking did not include, and we heard Administrator Farrell say, did not include the consideration of those early morning hours, which we know people are forced to work in when traffic is more. So let me just ask you this, because it's going to be abstract and we don't have any study about this. We should have, but we don't. What is your best guess that telling people, I mean, you can be direct. We're just trying to get to the bottom of this. What's your best guess happens when you don't study the effects of something, but yet you tell people when to go to bed and when not to go to bed, and we know that it pushes them into hours that are much busier, makes them perhaps even drive longer because of the congestion. I'll just ask it this way. Do you think that should have been part of the study? And if so, do you think that would change the results of the study that were the study?
I think it would have been a very good idea if they had looked at that very explicitly. And as near as I can tell, they haven't prior to the study that's in activity right now.
Well, as near as we've heard, they haven't.
Right.
And yet have no intention of doing that. So, and I don't want to put words in your mouth. I'll do this on my own. So if I were to suggest to you that had they included that, they may have come up with actually causing more accidents, more deaths, more fatigue, more stress to the overall system. I mean, that's kind of what it feels like to me, especially being a guy who's spent thousands of hours on heavy equipment. But
it's certainly possible, and then whenever you get into a situation like you're in with the extended hours of driving out to 10 hours or 11 hours, you're left with an assessment that says, is the benefit of doing something greater than the cost? And presumably when they did the benefit assessment on increasing from 10 to 11 hours, they assessed in their regulatory impact assessment that there was a benefit from doing that. Presumably they would have a similar kind of a benefit assessment. But please don't ask me about that because I don't do benefit assessments.
No, but I mean, the conclusion is that we don't know the truth because we haven't, the study not only isn't complete, but it isn't even inclusive enough to come up with a result that's based on science in your industry or in your field.
Yeah, I don't know of any study that's looked at that particular restart configuration.
But you'd agree that that should potentially be part of it.
Yes.
Throw the word potentially out there just to make
Right.
it a little easier for you
Yes.
to say yes. Thank you very much. Go ahead. We're taking up other people's time, but sure, Mr. Rice, I'm happy to.
I figure you guys came all the way here. You don't mind 5 more minutes, do you?
Take it.
You guys, Mr. Evans, Mr. Curl, Mr. Long, any of y'all short haul, or you all long haul?
My company does a variant of both long and short haul.
I do limited short haul.
You think these driver fatigue regulations are really applicable to short haul? I mean, it seems to me that what we're aiming at here, somebody who's driving, 10 hours a day continuously, and the effect of the highway driving is, you think these are applicable? I'm thinking about the guy who delivers the beer to the grocery stores or the bread, or the guy who's driving an asphalt truck or a concrete truck. He's not driving for hours on end. They're driving, stopping, waiting, getting out the truck, delivering the load. You think these these regulations are really applicable to those people?
I do not.
I think to address that directly, I would say no. But if I could expound on that a little bit more.
Please do, sir.
I think when we're talking about fatigue, we're talking about something that I can look up here at this panel and I can see fatigue, So how do you...
Wait a minute.
Well, so it begs the question, how do you quantify fatigue? Now, I know Mr. Jovanis is involved in a lot of studies that tries to identify that, but, if you stay up and watch the football game one night and then you come back to work the next day, you may be somewhat fatigued, but it doesn't mean that you can't conduct your duties safely and efficiently as necessary. So, fatigue is a relative factor, and working short haul, day to day, sometimes I'm more fatigued by it because it's a lot of work. But again, you have to go back to giving the drivers themselves the control of knowing when they need to rest, given a set of hours to work in. But, to have a blanket law that covers everybody, it's going to help a few, but it's going to hurt a lot more. So the hours of service as they are, and we do need hours of service, let me throw that in there. And returning to the old hours of service would be an advantage, but it's not a solution.
You think that the old hours of service rules were effective in reducing injuries and fatalities?
To a degree, I do.
I agree with you. I think they were.
I do. I believe they needed modification as well. I just happen to believe that the modifications we made were not the right ones.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Long, your opinion on this?
Yes, I believe that the older regulations, if you will, the 2003, the statistics prove out that they were safe and that we had a big reduction in fatalities. And safety is our #1 priority in the trucking industry. Now, from the perspective of a long haul or versus a short haul, my company, we provide mainly the longer haul, more miles. And we're having the biggest difficulty with our drivers. It has to do with their reduction in their productivity, being able to go out and make for example, a trip from Memphis to Chicago. It's about 500 miles. Our customers want the shipment to be delivered at 7 o'clock in the morning, but if the drivers can't leave until 5 o'clock because they came in at a certain time, the example that I gave, then that team cannot go out on that run. We may have to use another team. So that team loses that day. In fact, we've calculated, just using the last quarter of our information, that if this continues on the rest of the year, a lot of our teams are going to lose as much as 1 week's pay per year, which that's a lot of money to our people. For example, about $1,300, where they average about $60,000 per year.
How many teams do you have?
About 45.
Okay, so if each one loses a week, that's 45 weeks, right?
That's right.
So that means you're going to have another team. What does that do to the cost of shipping?
It makes it go up.
What does that do to our manufacturers when they're shipping stuff around the world?
It will make a cost on the product.
It makes them less competitive, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
So their stuff costs more around the world. They may be laying people off. You may not have to hire another team after all. Well, that's what I want to get rid of. The whole thing is American competitiveness.
We want to be efficient and productive, and we want our people to be compensated well.
I agree. Mr. Jovanis, you work on statistics, right, sir?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. The administrator this morning said that this could save as many as 19 lives a year, right? That's what she said.
Yes, she did.
All right. How many people are being killed on the road every year by trucks or in trucking accidents?
In trucking accidents, on the order of 4,000 fatalities or a little more.
So if we're talking about 19, we're talking about less than 0.5%. If we put this rule in effect, are we going to know that it has had any effect at all? Is there any way to statistically establish whether this rule is going to have any effect at all?
I would say there is, and you need to be able to fund a research study that uses crash data and determines that the effect of the restart policy in particular either has an effect one way or the other. I'm not real enthusiastic about using the nationwide statistics on fatalities in truck involvement, only because there's so many other factors involved that you can never really tell on a national scale whether your particular action is really having the result that you're observing in fatalities. So certainly you would believe that the downturn in the economy since 2006 has had a big impact on reducing travel And so fatalities and crashes are down all over the country in all travel modes.
But they were going down before that.
Well, a bit, but we were pretty much stuck at about 40,000, and we took a big nosedive when the economy went down. So there's a study being proposed by the Transportation Research Board to answer just this question of why is it that we had such a big decline? Can we identify the actions that we took to contribute to that? Because right now, a lot of people are claiming credit, but I would say we really don't know.
The graphs that I've seen showed truck injuries and deaths dramatically dropping beginning around 2000.
I'd have to look at the numbers again.
And
sure.
and then they've come back up in the last 2 or 3 years, but they're still down 30%.
Yeah, but I mean,
my point is, statistically, I don't know how in the world you're ever going to know whether these things. If we're talking about 19, maybe possibly 19, based on an uncompleted study of 27 graduate students, how in the world are you going to know that costing these people this productivity and affecting American competitiveness the way that the trucking industry certainly does? How are we going to know that that is offset by lives saved or with such a small potential reward? I mean, certainly every life is vital and important and precious. But I don't know that we're ever going to know that we saved one life.
Well, all I can tell you is on the crash side, in one of the reports that's in my testimony, we were able to do a very limited study of the restart provision. And that's because we had only a limited amount of 2-week data in our study. And in that study, we showed that drivers had got past the first day of the restart pretty well, but it was in the second day of the restart that they had an increase in crash risk. Now, we haven't really publicized that widely because we had a very small number of drivers that actually experienced the restart and allowed us to do that comparison. But if we could do it with the data that we had back in 2010, certainly people can do that again and try to quantify that particular effect. So the best answer I can give you is research can help give you the answer on the increase in the probability of a crash or the number of crashes. And then somebody has to hand that over to the economists and the regulators and say, well, how does that get balanced against any kind of productivity losses or gains?
If I'm bouncing between the economists and the regulators and the truckers, I'm going to take the truckers every time.
No.
I guess go back to my first
I like
question.
them too.
Do you think it's going to make any difference? And I heard I don't know from you and a 3 no's from these guys. I'll take that. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming today. Thank you for putting up with us.
It's been our pleasure.
Good point. Just one last question, maybe 2. Some drivers say the new rules actually result in them taking breaks when they are alert and forcing them into a situation when they're more tired. And maybe is that true, Mr. Long, Mr. Curl, Mr. Evans?
Go ahead.
Yes, I'm hearing some stories like that. One of the effects of this has been also where trucks are having a difficulty finding parking spaces in truck stops. The truck stops are overloaded at times, and that presents a lot of stress trying to get in and park and fuel and so forth. So, yes, I'm hearing some of those stories like you just described.
As for me, it has made quite a difference because a lot of my stuff is planned out to make certain I have to get in my 11 hours of driving each day to be able to arrive on the proper day for my delivery and reload. So on some days when I have 30-minute required breaks, sometimes rather than driving 3 to 4 hours and taking a quarter-hour break, driving 3 or 4 hours, taking a quarter-hour break, and each time I take a break, I take care of my personal needs, but I also walk around and inspect my truck and look at my load. And now, because of this stipulation, it's going to move me further and further into the end of my day, into the period that Mr. Javanis referred to earlier as being more dangerous. And that time period is added on to the following day, so I start the following day a little bit later because of that. And so even if the 30-minute breaks could be cumulative, that would be helpful.
Thank you. Mr. Evans?
Sir, I think there are too many inconsistent circumstances with each driver, with each type of load, with each origin, with each destination, and to put a regulation that says that a driver has to take a 30-minute break at a certain period of time, a certain period of day, really puts a whole kink in the supply chain, and it's not going to make him a more safer driver by any means.
You go ahead, Doctor.
Well, I'm sure that there are some people somewhere who don't want to stop after 8 hours and take a mandatory break. But when you're dealing with large numbers of drivers, as we have, the first 5 hours or so of driving has a relatively constant risk of a crash. After that, the increase of a crash and with driving time goes up non-linearly. So you're looking at 20%, 30%, 40%, 50% the farther you go into your drive. So if you're into the 8th hour, you're into an elevated crash risk. Now, Mr. Curl's suggestion about cumulative off-duty time, if you take a 15-minute break, drive for a while, take another 15-minute break, I think if you look at the literature on this, that half an hour that you experienced is almost the same as a half an hour single break in terms of its benefit, and the benefit is unmistakable in terms of reducing the risk of a crash. So I'm surprised that the regulations don't allow that, exactly what you said, because if you look in the literature at how you should undertake tasks like driving a truck, exactly what Mr. Curl said is exactly how you should from a performance maintenance point of view. You know, you take a periodic break, you take care of whatever thing you have to do physically, you inspect the truck, you get back in, and that's a
once again, the government's overly prescriptive.
Well,
and telling drivers something they already know, that they want to live safely and live to drive another day, and yet here we are telling them that they have to follow our rules rather than their own needs and experience. I want to thank you all for being here today. You provided important insights on how decisions are made in Washington and how they affect small business. I also want to say that there's no one here that I've heard that doesn't find that the 2003 rule provided benefits, and the studies show that. The question here today is, does the additional rule provide any benefit? In fact, does it provide a disbenefit? And you've been helpful in that direction. I ask unanimous consent that members and the public have 5 legislative days to include supporting material into the hearing record. Hearing no objection, this is now adjourned. And again, thank you very much.
Thank you.